Hi, and welcome to our webinar series at the Boone Center for the Family on coming to a place of peace during COVID-19. Today we'll be talking about the issue of shaken identity, and then we have upcoming webinars on the issues of anxiety, loneliness, and finances that we would love for you to join us for as well. My name is Sharon Hargrave, and I'm the Executive Director of the Boone Center for the Family. And I also wanted to let you know before we start today about a brand new resource we have called Restoring Relationships. It's a research study that we've done with the Barna Group, and it talks specifically about how Christian leaders, both in churches and academic institutions and Christian organizations, can help people understand the issues that they face with the stresses that are caused by COVID-19, but also that how important it is for churches to be involved in talking about both the theology and the psychology of the issues that people face normally with issues like we're talking about, of anxiety, loneliness, conflict, and how we deal with conflict. And so we just wanted to introduce this new resource for you today called Restoring Relationships to help you identify as a church and a Christian organization how you can also be helpful to people in the relationship and mental health awareness. This month of May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're excited to be able to share this with you. Today we're going to be talking about shaken identity. And I am excited to introduce to you Dr. Ben Houltberg. He is the Director of Research at the University of Southern California Performance Science Institute at the Marshall School of Business. Ben has done a lot of work over the years with both professionals and elite athletes, and he also is a Christian and highly committed to seeing issues in the church. Seeing issues in the church and done in a professional way. So I'm really excited to have you with us today, Ben, and look forward to what you have to share with us about shaken identity.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I'm happy to be here, and like many of you probably, I'm tucked away in my house, away from my 5- and 2-year-old to try to have not too much background noise. And it's kind of the new normal of what's going on right now. So I'm very, very happy to be here. You know, this idea of, well, actually, first I want to start with the polling. So I want to get a poll of this question. So I'm going to share a poll, and I would love if you would answer this anonymous poll, and then we'll look at the results together. So it should be up on your screen now. And the question is, my self-worth is affected by my performance at work or as an athlete by my performance in competition? We'll just give a few moments. The answers are coming in. Few more seconds. Okay, so let's just look at these results as we kind of dive into this idea of identity. And I want to talk about how performance often plays into how we think about our identity. So here's the results. And you can see kind of a skewed distribution towards above the 4, which is more towards the very much. A lot of 33% of you answered in that kind of 5 categories. So it definitely plays into your identity. And you can see a lower amount are on the low end of this, is that not at all, or just above not at all. And so this is an issue that I deeply care about, is how we form our sense of identity. And what I want to talk about, there's different theories of identity, but I want to talk specifically about this idea of narrative identity first. And narrative identity is such a powerful way that we devise our stories. So throughout our lives, we are telling stories about ourselves that becomes our reality. It becomes how we see the world. It becomes how we manage our emotions. That narrative identity is our internalized and evolving life story. We pick up on we internalize often the voices around us. Important people in our lives will often tell us things about ourselves that over time can be a pattern of how we speak to ourselves and how we see ourselves. And the power of a narrative identity is that we really go to great lengths to protect it. So it impacts how we think of the past and how we even think of the future. All of you can think of an example of this. I can, well, a really easy example of this is when something happens in my house and I go to my almost 6-year-old and almost 3-year-old and I say, what happened? Both of them have very different stories about the baking powder that's all over the floor. They're trying to protect their story in that way. Even at a young age, they're maintaining that sense of their story. And we do that all the time with the way we remember ourselves and the way we think of ourselves in the future. When we're in these situations that we're in now, in very difficult times that perturb kind of our narrative, our self-narrative, it creates both an opportunity to start to become aware of what our identity has really centered around, and an opportunity to revise it. And that's the beauty of a narrative identity, is we can expand our narrative to begin to include and revise it. And sometimes it means we have to become aware of the internalized narratives we have from the people around us. So another example of this that I'll give real quick personally, when I was coming up through high school, I showed up to my first class, my freshman year, and the math teacher looked at me and he said, "Not another Houltberg, they're not very good at math." Now, this teacher had my brother in class, and I have to admit, my brother did cause this guy a lot of heartache. And I remember that. But you know what was crazy is it's not just that statement, but others throughout my life of where I grew up and how I grew up. And academics was not just something I thought I was good at, but that statement, I believed it. The next day I went to my counselor. I asked him to change my class, and I got into a class called special geometry. And when I say special geometry, I don't mean AP. And so that narrative, I had to revise that narrative as I went to graduate school and had to change it to understand myself through a different lens that impacted how I view my competencies. So narrative identity becomes a really important piece of how we've shaped how we see the world.
So Ben, I'm really interested. I also wanted to mention to everybody, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for question and answers, and we'll try to get everybody's question answered as much as we possibly can. I think at times we've all had this idea that the only people that create our identity are our family members.
Right.
And yet you've mentioned a teacher that created an identity for you, and then we're talking about how COVID-19 can create an identity.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about sources of identity in that realm?
Yeah, I think developmentally, at younger ages in particular, the voice of the parents and the developmental relationships are so important to shaping that sense of identity for kids. But as you age, as you get older, and especially into high school, when you're starting to be around friends and you're starting to be around other caring adults, those voices begin to kind of shape how you see yourself. And you're gauging yourself and making social comparisons, especially in high school, where your brain and the way you function is poised towards social comparisons and also feeling pain from social rejection. And so there's this heightened kind of time of this identity that begins to form in really high school, but that now has really shown into emerging adulthood too, right? Is this idea of who am I, but not only who am I, but what can I give to the world? I mean, that's kind of this idea of narrative identity. So coaches can really shape this. I had some very meaningful coaches in my life that shaped my sense of identity and understanding of failure, of having the freedom to give all I can without the fear of results. I also grew up in the church, and as an athlete, I was an athlete myself, and as I competed very well and did well, I continually got held up in church and in the newspaper, and I was as really being an example for everybody. But what started to shape in me unintentionally was also that I was worth something in value when I won, when I did well, when I performed. Then I could make an impact on people's lives and be a witness, and I think that became a part of my narrative that I had to also revise and change. And that didn't come necessarily from an individual, but it came from this unintentional process of what sports can do, I think, in any performance context.
Great, thank you.
And I think the other part that I really became fascinated with this in for my own life, but also as we begin to study elite athletes. And we studied elite athletes, professional athletes, Olympic athletes, but also CEOs, mid-level managers at large organizations. And we studied this idea of performance-based identity. And the first paper that we published on this, we're interested in the narratives that came about in the athletes' lives. And so we discovered this performance-based identity narrative that really is defined by someone who puts their worth and value as a human being in their results. And this becomes a challenge because their world and their narrative begins to come around results. And there's a fear of failure for the social and personal consequences of not performing. And this can be really impactful for people as they prepare for a competition or some kind of performance, because the stakes are higher. And so it can wreak havoc on people's emotional health over time. And we found that in our study, that people with this performance-based identity had higher depression and anxiety, and saw competition as a threat, not as a challenge. And so this is also important to talk about, because I think we often think that this athlete or this person is the one who shows up early every day for practice, pushes really hard. And I was this athlete, and I ended up with 8 stress fractures and going through my own depression as I tried to transition to a new identity. And that's not uncommon for a lot of athletes and a lot of really anybody in a performance context. And so this performance-based identity becomes an important component.
I'm thinking right now of a couple of scenarios. One would be at Pepperdine University, many of our senior athletes especially didn't get to compete this spring. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on, solutions for when my identity is performance-based and I have no competition. Another very real right now scenario is me doing webinars, at my work. How many people are going to sign up? Are we going to get a good response? Are people going to like what we do? And so I wake up on webinar mornings probably less confident than the mornings of the year. So in this scenario that we're in right now, what are some of the solutions for thinking through this issue of performance-based identity and the narrative that we've created?
Yeah, I think first of all, just to acknowledge that loss for those seniors, for the athletes, it's the same at USC. That loss is real. There's a grieving process to this. Of a lot of hopes and dreams and work that's been put into getting ready for the season, and something's beyond your control takes that away. And this is like the ultimate opportunity for resilience. And adversity can really produce resilience, or it can produce pain that destroys. And I think that's part of the challenge as we help young people walk through this time, is to acknowledge the real grief and loss, because this is a real loss for them, and acknowledge that and walk through that with people and not minimize that, but at the same time also empower and say, this is also an opportunity to learn a new skill. This is an opportunity for some of the athletes that I was working with that were training for the Olympic trials that got canceled and pushed back. That became their narrative as a team, is saying, well, this gives us another year to train and to get better. to, and this will be another part of my story that somehow comes together to help me in my purpose, I think, as well. And so reframing this as an opportunity, but not doing it in a cheap way to where you're not acknowledging the pain of what we're experiencing right now, because we're all going through that. And so how do we train our mind to begin to shift from this kind of risk view of all of this going on to an opportunity for growth? And I think that shift comes in a couple ways. I think one is, as we're doing deep work in our identity, sometimes that requires us to go deeper in therapy or in programs like Relate Strong, that begin to really discuss the voices we've internalized that create the pain in our lives and some violations that have happened, and come to this place of peace where we're responsible for regulating our own emotional states. And I think from that point on, I think it can go from pain to peace to purpose. And when pain is transformed to purpose, it is the most powerful motivator in the world. And there's nothing wrong with striving for excellence and performance and wanting to give your all. It's what's behind it that matters. And when what's behind it is this kind of performance-based identity, it undermines your ability to really live in your full potential. But purpose is this powerful way of thinking about, how do I begin to build my identity around purpose? And we found this narrative also in our elite athletes that were just as successful. They were just as successful in sports. They had as many medals, but they had a deeper sense of meaning in their life. And this became important. So when I talk about purpose-based identity, it involves several things. It's building your identity around what's most meaningful in your life. So taking time to really reflect on that, and it's consistency and having behavior that aligns with that every day. But it also is this kind of hope for the future. And so those become really important. And so for solutions, Sharon, I think really thinking about, if we just a quick breakdown of what purpose is, because it's such a popular word out there. The science of purpose shows really there's three really important elements. And so if you're thinking about purpose, at first is this personal meaning. And so going through an exercise, and we don't have time to do it today, but writing down, what do I value? What is most meaningful to me? And I do this exercise with people, and when they write these things down, I have them speak them out loud, and it becomes this moment of people really sharing what is most meaningful to you. No matter if you're the Olympic gold medalist or not an athlete at all, they start to see patterns of connection in what's meaningful to them. And the second part is this long-term aim. You see the big picture, you see the view, the telos. And as Christians, we can have hope in that idea of that long-term aim. And then the third one is beyond the self-motivation, that we find and pull from resources that motivate us beyond just ourselves. This isn't about bearing down and just trying harder. That's not what this is about. Because that leads to the performance-based identity. And in some ways, when we talk about narrative identity in these times, it also involves surrender, which is really difficult, I think. And so, so again, I think coming back to what's meaningful to you, beginning to think about on one side of the equation, what's meaningful. On the other side of the equation, what behaviors are you doing every day that is related to that meaning? And when that is off and there's a big discrepancy between those, then that's when we often feel anxious and have a difficult time. And then finally, really thinking about what is it beyond ourselves, that understanding that we are unconditionally loved by God, and that there is, we can trust his goodness in this situation, becomes really important, and has gotten people from the science of purpose, that transcendent purpose has gotten people through horrendous times. If you think about people like Viktor Frankl, who really talks about, if you know your why, you can get through almost any how. And he relies on this transcendent purpose, and there's stories of this, of course, in our Christian tradition as well. And so this isn't an idea of just work harder, but it's beginning to expand and understand who we are, what we're about, and seeing this opportunity of this change in our habits, to then begin to create new ways of living after this is done.
That's excellent. I can really see how slowing down enough to define my purpose could really change the whole idea of what's success. And I know we've all read and talked about this longitudinal study that Harvard did in the last several years about, following people for 75 years of their life, and how, what mattered at the end of life for people, whether they were very successful in their jobs or not very successful or anything like that, it was their relationships.
That's right.
And so I just really think that's really motivational to think about our purpose and to fit that into our everyday job, whether that's our job as an Olympic athlete, or the director of the Boone Center for the Family, or mom or dad, or whatever that sits before us. So we want to open it up to questions right now. And while we're moving towards those questions, I just want to note that there are resources at the Boone Center for the Family. We do have this Relate Strong program that helps people understand their own sense of identity and sense of safety. We have some other videos and webinars on our website that are available. I want to introduce April Davis. April's been monitoring the questions for us, and so April and Ben are going to try to deal with as many questions as we can. If we don't get your question answered, please send us an email, but April will try to condense as many of them for us as she can. Thanks so much, April.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Ben. This is really great stuff you've got there. So right now I'm actually just seeing one question. So if anyone has something that they've been kind of hanging on to, go ahead and type it into the Q&A so we can address it live for you. So Ben, this first question is commenting, well, it makes a lot of sense, and it's easy to see how coaches and key other people in our lives can have a really deep and impactful effect on our narrative identities. But this person is wondering, how can we as individuals change or modify our narrative identities, if at all? What's the extent of power in that?
Yeah, I think it's as we experience more autonomy and through the developmental process, we are empowered now to have the autonomy to revise and change our narrative identities. And I think it starts with the awareness of the way we've internalized other people's voices in our lives, the awareness of emotion, our emotions in the moment, and beginning to acknowledge it, and then beginning to revise it on a dynamic basis. So let me just give a quick example. So that's maybe hits home for some people is my wife and I are both working remotely. We have 2 small kids. We're trying to balance everything out on top of everything else going on in our life. And often we're working and our kids are trying to play, get our attention. And if I snap at them and get angry at them and I come off harsh on them, often what can happen for me and my self-narrative is I begin to have this voice on my shoulder that says, "Oh, Ben, you're a lousy dad. You're running your kids. You're a developmental psychologist. What are you thinking?" And I have to, that creates a lot of angst in me. And so the body often gives us the clues so I can become aware of that. And I can become aware of that message or that voice. And then I can challenge it, and I can challenge it with truth. And this is, again, part of what restoration therapy and Relate Strong do, but being able to do that dynamically on a day-to-day basis begins to change how we interact with ourselves. And it even begins, and even I could nerd out about this, but even around neural connections of where we kind of, where self-narrative and our self-awareness comes into play can shift and change. And so I think that's a beautiful thing. And so, yes, you are empowered to. I'd say it starts with becoming aware of those messages, write them down when you hear them. Most of the time we say things to ourselves that we would never say to people that we love around us. And so, and the reason why this is so important is, as Sharon mentioned, is a performance-based identity, especially, it cuts us off from the people we love. It turns us in. A purpose-based identity expands us to recognize that we are dependent also on the connection to other people, but we are responsible for our own emotion and our own emotion regulation.
Wow, thank you. So we've got several questions now that have come in. What are some examples of what purpose-based identities can sound like for adolescent athletes, especially as it relates to the beyond self component? Can you provide maybe both a Christian and a secular example of what that could look like?
Sure. One quick example of this was a kid that I worked with a long time ago in high school, and he was a Christian, and he would not even be able to complete the competition because he would literally pass out. He physiologically was tapping his resources because of fear before the race started, that he wasn't able to finish the race. He was a freshman going through this kind of sense of identity. He came to me one day and talked to me about this and said, I'm gonna have to quit. I can't do this to myself. He got all the medical testing done. And so we simply started working on his identity and what that meant, and where his meaning base was, and that his faith was so important. And so we started to expand and think about this idea of identity around God's love for him, and that competition is an expression of that love, not a definition of who he is. And we just really started thinking about this identity around that, that began to free him up to really experience the joy of sports. And so in high school, I think in particular, we can help shape adolescence by making sure we're countering the performance-based message to really say it starts with first knowing we are deeply and unconditionally loved. And that gives us the freedom to work hard, put it all out there without the fear of the results. And I think that becomes really important. I think sports will naturally lead youth towards performance-based identity unless there's voices that help shape it differently. So from a non-Christian or from a secular perspective, we, and this is the same for Christians too, but one of the partnerships with Hope Sports, a guy named Guy East who founded Hope Sports, we worked together in creating curriculum that was embodied in short-term service trips. And so what we did is we brought Olympians and professional athletes to build homes for the poor. And in that process, we began to help them form a sense of identity and worth and value and meaning in more than just their sports. And so really those short-term service trips, doing good for others, and this sense of gratitude becomes really important with the athletes that I work with that are not, don't come from a Christian background.
So April, it looks like we have time for about one more question, you think?
Okay, so thank you everyone for putting in your questions. Please note that we are hoping to be able to follow up with you with the ones that we don't have time for. We've had one that came in that's pretty timely, Ben. So as parents or significant others of people who are suffering from loss of identity, whether it's through their job or athletic competitions that have been canceled, how can we bring up these issues and address them with our loved ones when we ourselves may not be suffering from them, but to come alongside of our loved ones who are? And how do we just bring that up delicately or outright, or how do we navigate these?
Yeah, that can be tough when we see things with our spouse or our partner. I think ultimately the person has to take responsibility for kind of handling this emotion. But I think it can be really powerful to just reflect back what you're seeing is in an empathic way of saying, I can see this is really difficult for you. I know how much your work means to you. I know how much sports means to you, or your athletic career. I can see that you're in pain right now. And taking it from that angle could be really, really a different angle of starting from empathy rather than kind of pointing out, maybe that they're overreacting to things or they're doing things that are responding out of this pain. Because I think ultimately performance-based identity, or even these ideas become so unconscious that we just most of the time are just living them out. And so it's opportunities to then become aware of them. And when a loved one starts pointing that out, hopefully what that can do in an empathic way, it can help me start to think about that as well. Since my wife and I have gone through and talked about kind of our pain cycles and thought about that, we often will do it out loud to each other, which really helps us move forward in any kind of conflict or things going around. But also point them to the upcoming webinars, point them to what's coming up here. And certainly this message you'll hear on the other webinars that are being offered about with resources and opportunities.
Yeah, Ben, I just want to say thanks so much for today. And as a parent of adult children, watching them go through identity issues, all of my children live in New York City, which is a place where identity is really stressed.
Mm.
And I just want to really agree with Ben with what you said is listening and being present and not trying to fix
Yeah.
our children's pain is really an important part. I think helping people talk about hard times and beginning to put a sense of hope that things will get better. The COVID-19 is not going to be with us forever. But I think as parents, especially of university students and above in age, we want to be careful to be supportive and come alongside. And I really like Ben's idea. This webinar is going to be up for viewing later. And I think you might want to just say, hey, saw this guy that works with, you know, Olympic athletes talk about identity. Thought this might be an interesting resource for you. So again, these are tough times. We are walking through them together, and certainly identity and who we are and how we do things has been shaken. So Ben, so thankful for your time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate your expertise and the stories and the information that you've shared with us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody. And have a lot of grace for each other, and know that you are uniquely and unconditionally loved, and that there's a purpose for you that nobody else can take, and that purpose is not dependent on anything outside of just who you are in Christ and in the way He created you. He created you for purpose. So thank you. And Sharon, it's always good to see you.
Yeah. See you later.
All right, see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.